The progressive movement was a period between the 1870s and the 1910s that aimed to improve society. They wanted to return control of the government back to the common people. They wanted to restore equal economic opportunity and correct social injustices.
The success of big business in the Gilded Age had a dark side. It was the exploitation of labor. New technologies and innovations made workers less valuable to firms. Skilled and unskilled labor were replaced by new machinery and new equipment in all areas of the workforce. Workers received low wages. Working conditions were so dangerous that 1 in every 300 workers were either injured or killed on the job. Workers also faced long hours.
Child labor was a common practice during the Gilded Age. Due to these conditions, workers demanded change. These workers merged and consolidated into monopolies of the workforce. These monopolies were called labor unions. Workers wanted to get better wages and better working conditions from their bosses.
In order to achieve their goals, unions used diverse strategies. Some of these strategies were peaceful, some not so peaceful. One strategy was collective bargaining. Collective bargaining was when unions negotiated deals with their bosses as a group. The principle behind collective bargaining is strength in numbers.
The next strategy that was used was strikes. Strikes are work stoppages in which unions would pressure firms with shutting down their factories with the threat of losing profits. Some groups sought to help the poor and hungry through charity. This all leads to the social gospel movement. The social gospel movement was a social reform movement that sought to secure social justice and better lives for the poor through charity. This movement strove to improve society by weaving charity and goodwill with Christian morals, meaning the movement was based on Christian values and the Bible. Charities were formed to feed the hungry, and tenements were created to house the homeless. All of these ideas were designed to counteract social Darwinism.
Some groups wanted to create economic reform. Major catalysts for this reform were muckrakers. Muckrakers were journalists who wrote about the corruption of big business. It caused a backlash versus businessmen, wealthy people, and corporate greed, and spurred Americans to call for further economic reform. One of the most famous muckrakers of the age was Upton Sinclair. His book, The Jungle, exposed terrible conditions in the meatpacking industry.
In Teddy Roosevelt's domestic agenda, he promised every American a square deal. The first point of the square deal is trust busting. Roosevelt believed a powerful government was essential to a democracy, and regulation was the key tool to Roosevelt's politics.
Hey, you can't do that!
However, Roosevelt also felt that big business was essential to society, but corrupt and evil trusts have hurt the people, and as a steward to the people, the government needs to step in to protect the general welfare. Roosevelt used the Sherman Antitrust Act to sue 44 trusts in 7 years in office. Ultimately, the Sherman Antitrust Act promoted competition between these businesses. Roosevelt also acted to guard consumer health. After reading The Jungle, Roosevelt used his persona to push for change. In 1906, Roosevelt signed the Meat Inspection Act, and this mandated strict cleanliness in meat plants. Going after the substandard food and drug industry, Roosevelt signs the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906. This act required truth in labeling and banned the sale of contaminated food and drugs. Both of these laws are still in act today.
And finally, one of the causes closest to Roosevelt's heart was nature conservation. After 100 years of Western migration, American resources were disappearing. Roosevelt saw the conservation of U.S. natural resources and forest land as a primary concern. Advised by naturalist John Muir, Roosevelt set aside 148 million acres of natural forest land.
Keep your hands off those trees!
He created wildlife preserves and empowered the U.S. Forest Service to ban the sale of federal wilderness. Roosevelt also set up the U.S. Geological Survey to explore for resources. Today, Yosemite and Sequoia are two natural parks that can credit their preservation to Teddy Roosevelt. Wilson, a progressive, sets out on an agenda to continue reforms focused on finance and economics. Wilson's legacy is that of an intelligent reformer and father of the modern financial system.
Next, we have trust and regulation. Wilson continued the regulation of business and trust like Teddy Roosevelt and Taft. In 1914, he created the Federal Trade Commission. The FTC is a watchdog agency and has the power to investigate firms for evidence of regulatory violations.
Wilson also continued the progressive agenda of trust busting. In 1914, Wilson signs the Clayton Antitrust Act. It is undoubtedly the biggest antitrust law of the progressive era. First, it strengthened the Sherman Antitrust Act. It also affirmed that labor unions had the right to exist and therefore unionize, and couldn't be sued as trusts themselves. It also lawfully allowed strikes and other labor strategies.